January 23rd, 1942. The final solution. I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week, the Japanese offensives in Southeast Asia and the Pacific continued and grew even larger as they invaded the Dutch East Indies. The Soviet offensives also continued and grew larger on the Eastern Front, and at sea, German U-boats began major operations just off the east coast of the United States. Something that's finishing this week happens in North Africa. On the 17th, the British finally take Halfaya Pass and 5,500 Axis prisoners. It has held out isolated for 2 months under Major the Reverend Wilhelm Bach. This is the end of the frontier battles, but they were important. The Italians at Halfaya and Bardia tied down a whole British division, blocked the coastal road, and prevented the railway from being built out to Fort Capuzzo. This is also really the end of Operation Crusader, though it actively ended in December. Just comparing casualty figures, between November and now, the Allies took 17,700 casualties, 15% of the total they used, and the Axis 38,300, 32% of theirs. So this is, on paper, a decisive Allied victory. But not in actual reality, they did not achieve their aims. And Axis Commander Erwin Rommel has his supply system still in place and has administrative security. And he's perfectly capable of continuing the fight. In the final analysis, however, it was bad tactics and a weakness in command that contributed most to the British failure to gain a thoroughly decisive victory, the underlying factor being the inability of the senior officers to handle large forces of armor on the battlefield. But it's not like they had been trained to handle larger armor groups, because they hadn't. So it was trial and error. And remember, this was the first time ever that a British armored corps had been established. Britain had never even had an armored division until 1939, and had not had time for real training with real equipment since then, with or without the Sahara Desert. And the enemy certainly has plenty of active campaign experience. But victory it is, though not decisive victory. And Theater Commander Claude Auchinleck and his staff are pretty confident about the future. They're going to prepare for another advance. And of course, Rommel is in no position to mount an offensive of his own for the time being. Except not. He gets 54 new tanks on the 15th, but already decided last week to launch a spoiler attack to delay any coming enemy offensive. He's got 300 planes or so that can give at least local air supremacy, and 37,000 Italian and German troops is larger than anything British 8th Army Commander Neil Ritchie can bring into frontline battle. He's also had terrible weather on his side lately, preventing British planes from spotting his preparations. So when Rommel attacks the morning of the 21st, the British are taken totally by surprise. The Axis quickly advance, and by 11 a.m. on the 22nd have taken Agadabia. Ritchie does not believe it possible that Rommel has the strength for a strong attack east of there, so he delays counterattacks to protect his forces until Rommel has overextended himself, which does not happen this week. And at just the moment Rommel is cruising into Cyrenaica, the Australian government is threatening to withdraw all of its forces from Egypt because of the impending Japanese threat to Australia. Fortunately, American President Franklin Roosevelt has agreed to send 20,000 soldiers across the Pacific, with 50,000 more to follow if the Japanese advances continue. But Singapore is becoming a critical issue. Australian Prime Minister John Curtin wires British Prime Minister Winston Churchill the 23rd. After all the assurance we have been given, the evacuation of Singapore would be regarded as inexcusable. But the Japanese have been closing in on the Straits of Johor and Singapore Island. They have been stopped for the moment heading down the trunk road by the Australian 22nd Brigade, but are making good progress against the 45th Indian Brigade. This week on the 18th, though, Japanese tanks with no infantry support are just obliterated on the road to Bakri, as is a Japanese battalion attack at Bakri, both by Australian troops. But as Richard Frank points out, it was here that they learned that Japanese soldiers would not surrender. They also have learned that the Japanese here are not taking prisoners, and prisoners too wounded to move are now asking to be shot rather than bayoneted or beheaded by the advancing Japanese. On the morning of January 22nd, about 110 Australians and 40 Indians too wounded to move fell into Japanese hands. Over the next day, the Japanese proceeded to massacre them by gunshot, bayonet, beheading, and burning prisoners alive. For more on that and other such events, please watch Spartacus's subseries War Against Humanity. It covers all sorts of things like that in more depth than I am able to here. By the 21st, the Allied forces in Malaya are retreating south of the Muar River. The Japanese are also advancing on Bataan in the Philippines. On the 20th, the Abu Kai line begins to cave in. The next day, 5,000 fresh Japanese troop arrivals break through the right flank on Mount Natib's slopes. The 22nd, the left flank begins to collapse under heavy air attacks. That day, American Commander Douglas MacArthur sends his Chief of Staff Richard Sutherland to get a first-hand look at the front, and Sutherland advises retreating to a new defensive line. There is a Japanese attempt the final night of the week to outflank the defenders on Bataan's west coast and cut the west coast road, but this ends in disaster for the Japanese. A patrol boat splits up the convoy, sinks 2 ships, and captures the plans, and although it takes a week and in some places 2 weeks, the 2 groups of Japanese who land are overwhelmed and virtually all of them are killed. They both failed to land where they were supposed to anyhow. This first landing is the beginning of what will be known as the Battle of the Points. On the 20th, the port of Rabaul on New Britain is attacked by over 100 planes from 2 Japanese carriers. These destroy the coastal artillery. On the 23rd, the Japanese land, and heavy fighting breaks out between them and the defending Australians. The invaders take the Lakunai airfield and scatter the defenders into the island's interior. The Germans and Japanese are not the only ones advancing this week, though. The Soviets are as well. On the 20th, Andrei Yeremenko begins the storming of Toropets and its supply center with the 4th Shock Army. The Red Army will take 6 tanks, 723 trucks, 450,000 shells, millions of rounds of ammunition, 1,000 drums of fuel, and a full 40 food dumps. Vasily Morozov's 11th Army, now beefed up by the 1st and 2nd Guards Rifle Corps, is by Staraya Russa, and Maxim Perkayev's 3rd Shock Army by Kholm. And there might be an opportunity. See, between them is the 2nd Corps of the German 16th Army at Demyansk in the forests and the marshes. Heading south from Staraya Russa and north from Kholm could encircle those 100,000 German troops, which would be a major feat. On the 17th, Pavel Kurochkin, commander of the Northwestern Front, writes to Joseph Stalin that the 11th Army should be sent to Kholm to complete the encirclement. Stavka likes the plan in general, but Kurochkin already has a defined basic plan, heading the 11th Army to Soltsi and then into the rear of the German forces at Novgorod, and sending the Guards Corps to Pskov to cut enemy communications. Kurochkin says, yeah, sure. Let's do these 2 objectives in successive stages. But Stavka says, no, do them both at once. And that's despite the fact that the Germans are grimly hanging on to both Staraya Russa and Kholm. But Stalin makes a bunch of decisions this week, backing up his intention of destroying both army groups center and north. On the 19th, Kurochkin gets word that both the 3rd and 4th Shock Armies, most of his left wing, are supposedly going to be transferring command to Ivan Konyev's Kalinin front. The 1st Shock Army is to be shifted from Georgy Zhukov's Western Front all the way up to Staraya Russa and be ready for action by February 6th. So Kurochkin gets that, and 2 rifle divisions and 2 rifle brigades will be deployed east of Staraya Russa, but not be subordinated to him, but to the 3rd Shock Army. Then, the plan is for the divisions to attack south from Staraya Russa to Kholm, cutting off the Germans in Demyansk. Then, elements of the 34th Army would destroy them. Then, in Kholm, everybody would link up and destroy the pocket of Germans forming there. You're right, it is both optimistic and confusing. Yes. Kurochkin is really angry about losing the 3rd Shock, and he tells Stalin so. Stalin also refuses his request for a unified command over the Demyansk operation. The forces for the operation seem seriously inadequate, but there is a real spirit of optimism here. The Stavka Directive, the 19th, which hands over the shock armies to Konev and deals with all that I just said, also says that Rzhev and Zubtsov must be taken no later than the 21st by Konev's front, that other units of his front must attack to Semlovo, west of Vyazma, no later than the 21st, and the 3rd Shock Army should attack from Kholm towards Veliki Luki, then Vitebsk, then all the way down to west of Smolensk, taking it in the process. So the Kalinin front now has objectives from Rzhev to Vyazma to Smolensk. John Erickson has this to say about that. This was pumping diminishing manpower out in expanding circles, at a point when men and machines were in desperately short supply. Yeremenko's divisions, which had been 8,000 strong 3 weeks ago, were now down to less than 2,000. The time was not far away when Colonel General Konev had only 35 tanks to his whole front, and divisional strengths were falling to 3,000 men, artillery regiments being left with only a dozen guns. All this to consummate the mammoth strategic assignment doled out by Stalin. But Konev was hammering last week at Rzhev and Sishovka to try and take the railway. So what happens now? Well, as the Red Army is repositioning and reassigning, the German 9th Army, defending at Rzhev, goes on the offensive. At 10 a.m. the 22nd, General Model's forces attack, supported by tanks and dive bombers west of Rzhev, and within 3 hours cut the Kalinin front in two, part of it north of Rzhev and part to the west and southwest. Stalin's decisions have also sabotaged Georgy Zhukov's western front. Losing the 1st Shock Army has caused his right to collapse. Zhukov's center, though, is still driving forward, and Vereya falls the 19th and Mozhaysk the 20th. In the south, Semyon Timoshenko is on the move for a few days, but at Balakleya and Slavyansk, German infantry stops a breakthrough at the end of the week. The German offensive in the Crimea that began last week takes Feodosia the 18th, and then the little bottleneck of Parpash, giving the Germans much shorter lines. The situation in the Crimea was now a rough stalemate, with perhaps a slight advantage to the Soviets. The Germans still held the body of the peninsula and the Perekop and Parpach bottlenecks that governed access to it, but the Red Army held both strategic points on the periphery, Sevastopol and Kerch. Manstein still had Sevastopol under siege, but 3 Soviet armies now lay to the east, a large dagger preparing to strike him in the back. Although the Crimea clearly wasn't a place where the issue of European hegemony would be settled, as Hitler once put it, it had come to occupy an increasingly important place in the strategic calculations of each side. There are things involving the high commands of each side that happened this week. On the 17th, Winston Churchill is returning from the US to Britain by flying boat. It deviates a bit from its course and even comes within a few minutes flying time of being in range of the German coastal AA guns at Brest. The pilot corrects course though and turns sharply to the north, but British radar watchers then identify the plane as a hostile bomber. 6 planes are sent up to shoot it down. Churchill will later sum up the results. They failed in their mission. That same day, en route to Leipzig from the Eastern Front, Walter von Reichenau dies. He has been commander of Army Group South since November. He had a stroke on the 14th and is flying in for treatment, but the plane crashes and he suffers head injuries. It is not clear whether it is the injuries or the stroke that kill him. Fedor von Bock, who was relieved of command from Army Group Center last month, replaces him. And on the 20th, at the Wannsee conference, Reinhard Heydrich presents plans to Adolf Hitler for the transport of all Jews to extermination camps. Among those present in this Berlin suburb is Martin Luther, part of the German Foreign Office, whose job is to persuade the governments of Europe to cooperate in what is called the final solution of the Jewish question. Heydrich says that all 11 million Jews in Europe must fall away, and they would comb the continent to find them. Stuttgart, who had helped draft the Nuremberg race laws in 1935, proposes forced sterilization for a variety of non-Aryans. What is going to be the model for basic technique is the gas van system at Chelmno. For the past month, over 1,000 Jews a day have been packed into the vans and killed by gas during the drive to the burial site in the woods. Soon, more vans and diesel fume gas chambers will be set up at Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. These are remote locations, but they are on railway lines, and that is how the Jews will arrive. And there will be no choosing of able bodies or exceptionally strong or fit people for factory or farm labor. All who arrive are to be murdered. Adolf Eichmann is to be in charge of seeing that the deportations and the murders are systematic and well organized. This will, of course, be covered in much more depth in our War Against Humanity series. And here, I will end this week of this series. With the Japanese still advancing all over in Southeast Asia and the South Pacific, the Soviets advancing but being given ever more unrealistic objectives, Rommel advancing by surprise in Africa, and a fateful decision being made that will have enormous repercussions for the future of the world. Yep, breaking the timeline here. But it's not really a spoiler, is it? You know what happens. The Germans and some of their allies build the death camp system and try to exterminate an entire race of people. Well, and a bunch of other people as well. Remove millions of people from the earth by accident of birth, to systematically murder them. That's the depth of which humanity is capable. So that day, January 20th, 1942, is one of the darkest days in our history. Our War Against Humanity series, as I said, hosted by Spartacus, covers not just this, well, he will in a few days in the upcoming episode, but the crimes against humanity during this war committed by any side. You can check out the playlist for that right here. Never forget.